Every morning, Alex Murdaugh wakes up in a cold concrete cell barely big enough for a thin mattress and a steel toilet. No sunsets from Moselle, no beach house breezes, no comfort of wealth or influence. Just the harsh truth that he will never walk out again. This is the world he lives in now. Stripped of power, stripped of privilege, stripped of the identity he once hid behind. But here's what most people don't realize. For someone who lived his entire life believing he controlled every room he walked into, this punishment may be far more crushing than death. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will completely change how you understand Alex Murdaugh's existence behind bars. Welcome back to the channel. And if you're new, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because today we're exposing the reality of Murdaugh's life inside South Carolina's most unforgiving correctional system. This isn't comfort. This isn't protection. And it's definitely not the privileged lifestyle some imagine for high-profile inmates. For those unfamiliar with the full story, Murdaugh is serving 2 consecutive life sentences for murdering his wife Maggie and his son Paul. Add to that the decades of time stacked on for financial crimes, and the picture becomes even darker. The man who once controlled courtrooms and commanded respect now wakes up in a cell smaller than most people's closets. But the real question is this: what is happening to him right now? And why do many believe his fate is even worse than death? Before we dive into the disturbing details of his daily routine, you need to know the very first thing that happened when Murdaugh arrived at Kirkland Correctional Institution, an event that shattered whatever sense of control he thought he still had. It was the moment everything changed forever. When Alex Murdaugh first stepped through the gates of Kirkland Correctional Institution, the air around him felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried in a courtroom. This wasn't the world where his last name opened doors. This wasn't the town where people whispered Murdaugh with fear or respect. This was the beginning of a life that would strip away everything he once used to define himself. Starting with the moment officers led him down a hallway so narrow it seemed intentionally designed to suffocate whatever pride a man had left. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering in that cold, institutional way that reminded him he was no longer in control of anything. Not his schedule, not his future, not even the way he breathed inside those walls. The first thing they did was separate him from everyone else. Not because he was dangerous, but because the system judged him too notorious to be placed in general population. Officers called it protective custody. But there was nothing protective about the way the steel door slammed behind him. It was isolation with a different name. Men in his position don't get cellmates, don't get conversations, don't get the comfort of routine human interaction. They get a concrete box and the echo of their own thoughts. For someone like Murdaugh, who once commanded rooms and manipulated narratives, silence was a punishment far worse than any sentence a judge could hand down. That he'd been through intake, stripped, photographed, cataloged, evaluated. Every piece of his old life reduced to paperwork and a number stitched onto a uniform. The same man who once walked into courtrooms in tailored suits now stood barefoot on a cold floor, waiting for officers to decide where he would sleep, how he would live, and when he would be allowed to speak. And as he waited, he learned quickly that reputation meant nothing here. If anything, the higher your fall, the more the system wanted to remind you exactly how low you now stood. They assigned him to a section designed for inmates considered high risk for assault, high risk for media exposure, or simply high risk for unraveling under pressure. From the moment he entered that wing, every footstep was monitored, every movement recorded, every moment scrutinized. Privacy didn't exist. Cameras watched the tiny cell where he would spend the majority of each day. Officers checked in at unpredictable hours, and the constant hum of the ventilation system made sleep feel like a privilege rather than a basic function of life. His cell measured just enough to pace 3 steps forward and 3 steps back. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy, the toilet exposed. A small steel desk was bolted to the wall, but Alex rarely touched it. There were no law books to bury himself in, no case files to study, no courtroom strategy to plan. For the first time in decades, his mind had no battles to fight, only memories to haunt him. And inside that crushing stillness, he began to realize that the system didn't need violence or aggression to break someone. Sometimes all it needed was time. Time to think. Time to replay every moment that led him there. Time to confront the one reality he could never manipulate. The truth closing in from every angle. His daily routine was the same, almost mechanical. Wake up before sunrise. Stand for count. receive a tray of food that barely resembled anything he used to eat, sit alone, walk alone, shower alone, every action monitored, every privilege conditional, and every day identical to the one before it. The monotony was brutal, but the unpredictability of the guards' decisions added a different kind of pressure. One wrong move, one perceived rule violation, and consequences could come swiftly. The most jarring part wasn't the physical confinement, it was the psychological compression. In his old world, he controlled narratives. In this one, he couldn't even control the light switch. Officers decided when it was on, when it was off, and when he should wake, whether he was sleeping or not. He didn't get to negotiate. He didn't get to argue. He didn't get to talk his way out of anything. The same mouth that once convinced juries and manipulated clients now held no power. The other inmates knew his name, even if they couldn't see him. Whispers carried down the hallway. Reputation traveled faster than footsteps. The guards didn't hide the fact that he was watched differently. That alone created tension. In prison, notoriety is a currency, and not always one that benefits the person carrying it. Some inmates saw him as a trophy. Others saw him as a threat. Others simply wanted to know whether the man they'd seen on television looked just as broken in real life. And every time a guard escorted him down the hallway, eyes followed through the narrow window slits. But the moment that truly signaled his new reality happened during his first full week. Officers searched his cell without warning. They flipped his mattress, removed every item he'd been issued, inspected every corner as if expecting him to hide something. It was standard procedure, but the message was clear. Trust didn't exist here. Not for him, not for anyone. And for a man who once controlled evidence, who once manipulated outcomes, the idea of being constantly searched without explanation was its own form of humiliation. The man who once walked freely across acres of private land now counted cracks in the concrete. The man who once spoke for a living now saved his words because there was no one to hear them. And the man who once believed he could outmaneuver any consequence now faced a reality he could neither navigate nor escape. For Alex Murdaugh, prison wasn't just confinement. It was the collapse of every identity he'd ever built. Alex's early weeks inside Kirkland didn't just chip away at him, they reshaped him. Every new rule, every unexpected check, every humiliating reminder of who he had become pushed him deeper into a reality he once believed was impossible. But if the isolation was designed to break him slowly, what happened next accelerated that fall far faster than anything he had prepared for. Because after the system stripped him of privacy, it moved on to something far more personal: control of his identity. The moment the psychological evaluation team entered his cell, Alex understood that his future would no longer be determined by a judge or a courtroom. It would be determined by people he had never met, people who cared nothing for his legacy or the weight his last name once carried. They asked questions not about evidence, not about crimes, not about motives, but about his mental stability, his fears, his coping mechanisms. They asked him to describe his emotional state, his routines, his thoughts when he woke up, and the flashes that ran through his mind when the lights shut off at night. For years, Alex had been able to keep his deepest thoughts hidden under a polished exterior. But in prison, those thoughts were no longer just personal weaknesses, they were security concerns. If he answered too honestly, the system could increase his restrictions. If he answered too strategically, they would know he was lying. In that small fluorescent-lit room, Alex faced a type of interrogation he couldn't manipulate. The evaluators weren't trying to catch him in a legal contradiction. They were trying to determine whether he was strong enough to survive the mental pressure of long-term isolation. And their decision would dictate everything. Once they finished, the guards moved him to a different section. Still restricted, still isolated, but with slightly more oversight, a place for inmates who were mentally fragile, high-profile, or considered at risk of sudden deterioration. It was here that Alex began to feel the weight of time differently. The days didn't just repeat, they dissolved into each other. He lost track of mornings, lost track of nights, lost track of the number of times the guards performed wellness checks. Then came the incident that exposed just how closely he was being monitored. One morning, officers escorted him from his cell with a tone that suggested something serious had happened. Alex didn't understand why until he reached a small room with a table and a stack of paperwork. They claimed he had violated an internal rule, a minor infraction, but one that, inside the system, carried heavy consequences. The accusation didn't matter as much as the response. Officers treated him like someone who had attempted to outsmart the institution. They searched his belongings twice. They interrogated him about interactions he couldn't recall. They reminded him that protective custody didn't exempt him from disciplinary measures. For a man who once commanded authority in every room, being spoken to like a rebellious child wasn't just humiliating, it was destabilizing. Even if the infraction was a misunderstanding or a routine procedural note, the message was unmistakable. He was not special. He was not exempt. He was simply one more inmate in a vast system, and the system would punish him the same as anyone else. But punishment wasn't the only pressure he faced. As weeks passed, rumors spread about him. Nothing moves faster in prison than whispered stories, and because inmates rarely saw him, they filled the gaps with their own narratives. Some believed he was being protected because he was dangerous. Others thought he was a target, someone whose downfall made him valuable for leverage. And then there were those who believed he still had hidden connections or influence, an assumption that followed him like a shadow. Pressure from the outside world didn't help. News coverage, social media discussions, public speculation, all of it made its way back to the inmates. Even those who never saw his face felt like they knew him. And for Alex, every rumor carried the same threat: attention. In prison, attention is a liability. It paints a target on your back and removes whatever thin protection silence normally offers. To manage that pressure, officers introduced a monitored routine. He was allowed limited recreation time, but always alone, always under watch. He exercised in a fenced area barely larger than the cell he slept in. He walked in circles, counting the steps, counting the minutes, counting the thoughts he tried not to replay. Sometimes he looked up at the sky, realizing it was the only part of the world that still looked familiar. His meals were delivered through a slot. His conversations were restricted. His access to other inmates was non-existent. But the one thing the system couldn't control was his mind, and that became both his only refuge and his worst enemy. Night after night, he replayed every decision that led him here. Every lie, every manipulation, every moment he thought he could outsmart the consequences closing in around him. The sense of powerlessness grew heavier each day, and then came another blow, one he had not anticipated: contact with his surviving son. Phone calls were monitored. Communications were limited. But when he did manage to speak, the conversation wasn't filled with comfort. It was filled with distance, confusion, anger, and reality. Alex could feel the strain even through the static. His words no longer carried authority. His explanations no longer carried weight. The dynamic had shifted. The roles had changed. And in those moments, he realized prison punished more than the body. It punished the connections that used to anchor him. As the weeks turned into months, Alex's world shrank even further. The guards noticed he had stopped asking questions. He followed instructions without argument. He moved slower. He spoke less. He seemed smaller, not physically, but in the way a person shrinks under the quiet pressure of constant surveillance and relentless routine. The man who once dominated conversations now struggled to hold eye contact with officers. The man who once shaped the fate of others now had no influence over his own. This wasn't just confinement. This was unraveling. Here's the final and unavoidable reality about Alex Murdaugh's fate. Even if every courtroom twist somehow bent in his favor, even if a miracle overturned his murder convictions, he still wouldn't walk out of prison. Those financial sentences he pleaded to, the fraud, the theft, the money laundering, they weren't symbolic punishments. They were stacked deliberately, relentlessly, and permanently. 40 years in federal custody, 22 more in state prison, all running consecutive to one another, separate from the double life sentences he already carries. That means even if the impossible happened and his murder convictions vanished tomorrow, he would still be facing decades of incarceration with no pathway to freedom. At 56 years old, the math alone seals his fate. He would be far beyond the limits of human life before eligibility even became a conversation. His story isn't one of redemption or return. It's one of inescapable finality. And that's exactly why this fate cuts deeper than a death sentence. Death row inmates have a countdown. Alex does not. People executed by the state avoid the slow torture of aging alone in a concrete tomb. Alex will feel every hour of it. Ending a life stops the suffering, but this punishment forces him to face it endlessly. He wakes up every day with the weight of what he did. He goes to sleep knowing there's no finish line, no courtroom miracle, no appeal that can reverse time or undo the pain he caused his family. Every rare visit, every monitored phone call, every unanswered ache in his chest reminds him of the life he destroyed, not accidentally, but by choice. For a man once surrounded by wealth, influence, and unchallenged authority, prison isn't only confinement. It's a mirror he can't look away from. Some people believe certain crimes deserve finality. Others think living with the truth is the harsher judgment. So what do you think? Is spending the rest of your life behind bars truly a deeper punishment than death itself? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this deep dive gave you clarity, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more investigative breakdowns, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious, and never forget that every action has a consequence.